this talk isn't about our workflow at GitHub or how we think you should work. This talk is for your weird, special, awesome, crazy workflow and how the API might be able to help you with that. There are over 530 endpoints in the GitHub API, which can be a little intimidating. But to start with, say you just want to dip your toe in and say hello to the API. You can make a request to the API anonymously to some endpoints like this Zen one. So you literally type that command in and you'll get back a little bit of wisdom. You can make an anonymous request to get information about a user. This will return only the information that is public, so it'll be the same information that you might get from the web UI. You'll notice that there's some extra information returned in the headers, and a couple of particular note here are the ones about rate limits. So these indicate how many requests you can make in a rolling time period, typically 1 hour, and how many of those you've already spent. Those limits are quite low for these anonymous, unauthenticated requests, so you'll soon want the API to recognize who you are, so you'll get more information back and get access to higher rate limits. The easiest way to do that is just with basic authentication, just simply using your GitHub username and password. You'll notice with that kind of request, you'll get more information back now that you're authenticated. So if you repeat that request to this user endpoint, you'll get back private information if you do the request for your own username. We're going to focus on the REST API in this talk. There is another API, the GraphQL API. That doesn't work just yet with some of the things that we're going to talk about, like GitHub Apps. It will work for GitHub Apps in the future, and it will be awesome. There's some amazing benefits of the GraphQL API, like finer-grained control over queries. So if you're curious about that, do go read the developer site. You can find out more about that. But for now, we'll look at the REST API because it works for everything right now, and it'll be an easier starting point, an easier learning curve. So after you're comfortable with some basic requests to 1 or 2 endpoints, you then have 3 options for authenticating to the API. We'll take a look at each of those just now. So the first option is a personal access token. That is simply a string. You can think of it like a password, but better. For example, you can have several of these, and you can revoke access to one of them at any time. This functions like an OAuth token, which means that you specify what permissions it can have. For example, whether it can write to your repositories. Some good ideas for using a personal access token are if you're acting just as yourself, like if you want to authenticate over the API as yourself, maybe for one-off curl commands or some personal scripts. Bad ideas for a personal access token are if you're setting something up for your whole team or company to use. That's a really bad idea because it'll be authenticating as you, but other people would be using it. Pretending to be a bot is a bad idea for a personal access token, and that would be something where you set up a shared user account to act as if it's a robot user. You can get a personal access token from your settings via the developer settings. So here you can generate a new one, and that's where you'd set what permissions it can have, and also where you can revoke the access of any that you've created in the past. Our second option is an OAuth application. As the name suggests, this is a full application, no longer just a string. So it needs to be hosted somewhere. And you grant it broad permissions like to all your repositories. Good ideas for an OAuth application are something that needs to act as a GitHub user, not necessarily you, but as a GitHub user across all of GitHub. This is a good idea for an identity service, like a login with GitHub. If an app dealt with something like user notifications, that would be a good example of something that needs to act as a GitHub user across all of GitHub to everything that user can see. bad ideas for an OAuth application, doing stuff on a specific repository, but you really don't want the app to have access to the rest of your repositories. And that's a bad idea because with OAuth scopes, repo scope gives the application access to all your repositories. Bad idea if you're doing stuff that really should be acting as the app itself. Because with OAuth, you're authenticating as a specific user. An OAuth application can only authenticate as one specific user at a time. So say this is a bad idea if one user sets up an OAuth app for the whole company to use, like a CI service, and then they leave that company and everything falls down. So you can register a new OAuth application via your settings, either your personal settings or under organization settings if you're an org admin. And the third option, which is relatively new to GitHub, is GitHub Apps. This is also an application and needs to be hosted somewhere. Unlike the OAuth application, you install this on specific repositories, and you grant it quite narrow permissions, like maybe just to write issues on those repos. Good ideas for a GitHub app. If the app needs to take specific actions as itself, like independent of a user, if you only wanted to do stuff on specific repositories, and if you want that direct connection with an organization, and you don't need to know everything that the user can do on GitHub. Bad ideas for a GitHub app would be as an identity provider, like just a login with GitHub service, or if you only want to act as the GitHub user in everything that they can do. So you can create a GitHub app via your settings, again, either via your personal developer settings or under the organization settings if you're an org admin. If these options cause you any confusion, you're not alone. So let's have a look at how you might decide which is right for you. A good starting point, I think, is to ask, does this thing need to only act as me? If yes, the next question could be, is it OK for it to access everything that I have access to on GitHub, like to all my repositories? If that's not OK, the best solution is a GitHub app, because you can select which repositories it has access to. If that is OK, maybe just next ask yourself, how complex is this thing? If it's a short and sweet script or two, a personal access token would be the simplest solution. If it's more involved or has several processes to it, an OAuth application would be the best solution. If this would need to act as more than just you, would it need to act as the app itself? If yes, then a GitHub app is the best solution. If no, next ask yourself, is it OK that this thing has access to everything that the authenticated GitHub user has access to? And if that's not OK, the best solution is a GitHub app. And if that is OK, or even desired, an OAuth application would be the right solution. So basically just thinking about who does it need to act as and what does it need access to. So some examples of things you might personally want to do with the API. You could simply use a personal access token to make quick one-off requests to the API rather than using a password. One of the nice things about personal access tokens is that you can revoke them, so they're safer to use and write down than using your password. You could store a token as a variable that your bash profile loads so that it's just readily available all the time. You don't need to look that up. Don't keep it somewhere that would be visible to others online. So you could then use that token stored as a variable in a shell script, say, for example, in a script that fetches your contributions. So you could build up a query that searches maybe for your PRs that you've merged over a certain time frame. This is a particularly useful thing to do around performance review time, to get maybe a list of PRs that you've shipped or contributed to in some way. So building something with the API doesn't need to be like the next best, fanciest CI service. It could simply be a tool to remind yourself what you even did at work last week. Some things that you could use the API for your whole team. Maybe you've outgrown that simple script and have more of a need for multiple scripts or a whole application. Something like a GitHub app could open up possibilities to connect with a whole bunch of other tools. And the keyword here is your workflow. Every company and team is different, and the valuable thing to figure out is how you could reduce friction in your workflow. GitHub simply can't provide flows that suit everyone via the web API, via the web UI, but the API provides that flexibility that you can probably use to create flows that suit your particular team's needs. Here's some possible examples. So I could turn that contribution script into a GitHub app that anyone in the team could use and contribute to. So maybe my team wants to make sure that they value a variety of contributions, like PRs that people have reviewed and contributed to, not just things that were shipped. And we could connect that to a Slack app so that we could all just use that with a simple command right from chat. Maybe your team uses specific labels to classify PRs, and it would just make life a little bit easier if you could fetch a list of those to glance at from chat. Maybe your team gets mentioned on a lot of pull requests, and you want to just check in on anything that hasn't been responded to yet. Maybe your team likes to create a summary of what everyone's been up to. This example shows that summary being created as an issue in GitHub, but it could just as easily be sent to an email list or used in whatever way suits your team. So there's a few steps to building a GitHub app. To start with, you need to create it, register it on GitHub. So in your setting page, there's a button to register a new app. If you do this from your organization settings page, that app would be owned by the organization. And if you do it from your personal developer settings page, that would be owned by yourself. If an app is going to be used by the organization, it should really be created under the organization settings and be owned by them. And that means then if the user that first registered that leaves the company, with GitHub Apps, the app will continue working just fine. So you'd enter some basics, like a name for the app and a URL. Unlike OAuth applications that have to go and create webhooks, the GitHub app will get one webhook by default, and that's all it needs. The address you enter for the webhook will be sent any events that your app subscribes to, like when new code has been pushed to a repo. It will automatically receive some default events, like when it's been installed or removed from an account. You should remember to secure this, so do enter a secret here in the settings. And the developer site has some guides on how to check that the incoming data to make sure that that's coming from GitHub. Otherwise, you could risk taking actions based on data that isn't legit, that hasn't actually come from GitHub. Another tip about those webhook settings, you could use a service like request bin here as a temporary webhook URL for your GitHub app, and from that site you could see the details of all the requests that are sent to that URL. So that's a cool way to get up and running and just experiment and explore the data before maybe you're even ready to host this thing somewhere. If you are doing something like this and sending data to a third-party service that isn't secure, just be aware to not send any data from private repositories. Also, in the advanced settings page of a GitHub app, you can check in on what has been sent, so you can see the data that's sent to your webhook URL from there, and even request that it's redelivered. The next part of the form you would fill out is to select what permissions your app would need. So for the kind of workflow examples we've just looked at, these are the permissions we'd need. So you'd be able to see sort of metadata about repository for free. We would like to be able to read and write some issues, but only read pull requests and also read information about the members in the organization. You'd be prompted to generate a private key. You'd download that key file, and it gets used to verify API requests as the application. GitHub doesn't store that private key, by the way. So next, you would configure your app. But first, let's just take a quick high-level look at the pieces of this again. So you have your app, which gets installed on an account, whether a user account or an organization account, and gets access to whatever repositories that the user has specified. Each installation here has no idea about any other installations that the app has access to. So for the app itself, you might want to ask the API these kind of questions, like what installations do I have? Give me a token for this installation. Who even am I? And when asking those high-level questions of the API, you'd want to authenticate as the app, which means using a private key that you generated back in the app settings page. So with that private key, you'd download that and store the contents of it. I store the contents of that, and it's a .pem file that you download, and I'd store the contents of that in an environment variable that I can then just reference in the app. And then we use that private key to sign a JSON web token, a JWT, and that's used for high-level application-wide authentication. So here I'm using the Authenticate client, which is a handy wrapper for the API. I'm passing it that JWT token. And then I can use that client, which holds the authentication as the app, to make API requests as that app. An installation is the part that's concerned with specific repositories and anything within them. So an installation might want to ask the API questions like these, like what repositories can I work with? What are the latest PRs in this repo? What issues have mentioned this team? And for those concerns of an installation, you would authenticate as that installation. So to make those requests authenticated as a specific installation, we'd request an access token for it and use that token to create a different Authenticate client which holds the authentication as the installation and makes API requests as that. A couple of things to watch out for with this. I guess a little confession also. Recently, I was making a GitHub app myself, and I kept getting a 401 unauthorized error for a request. And I tried debugging it, but the installation looked correct to me, and the token was legit, keeping in mind that I have access to all the API code and obviously the GitHub app that I'm building, so I can see all of the things and debug at all these stages. But I could not figure out why I was getting unauthorized errors. And it turned out I was authenticating as an installation for an endpoint that needed that higher level app authentication. So while I was getting an error that my credentials were invalid, it didn't mention that it expected those credentials to be the JWT type, not the regular installation token that I was using. So I am someone that not only has access to that code, but I wrote half that code, and that error caused me confusion for an embarrassing amount of time. Now, you won't run across that particular problem, because I then went in and fixed the error message, but if you do get stuck, please come talk to us in the platform forum. You're unlikely to be the only one. And even if that's something like you find an error message that's a bit unclear, or you get stuck in something giving you confusion, give us that feedback so that we can fix it and make building things with the API better with your help. So you've registered the app and configured it, then you need to host it somewhere. You could do that on a service like Heroku, which makes that part of the service pretty simple and also free. And then you install it. You can select whether to do that on all of your accounts repos or just specific ones. So here I'm selecting it just to be installed on one repo. Going back to this architecture, if you're building the app, how do you even know about installations? So in your app, set up that URL for the webhook. Via that URL, you can listen for these webhook events, and by default, events about installations will be sent to that URL. So your app will get sent an installation event, which would tell you whether the installation was just created or removed, and then you could add or remove data on your side accordingly. The docs URL at the bottom there has an example of what that event would look like. And then the fun part. So you could connect that GitHub app to whatever output suits your team. Like maybe you'd connect it to a Slack app, or use it to create or change content on GitHub. Heroku have an open source Dev Digest project that prepares content to send via email. Now that isn't a GitHub app yet, but maybe that's the kind of thing that somebody here would be interested in trying. And so for the examples I've mentioned, let's take a look at what you would need to do in the API. So fetching contributions for a given user. My app could have a method for contributions that accepts a user's login. This example is suited to what the Slack app would need. So the Slack app would send text like this, whatever text was typed after the command. So we could parse the login out of that. And we could then pass that user login received deeper into the app and create a search for issues, say issues written by that user with whatever other parameters we care about. The app would know which account this installation is on because it gets told that when the installation is created, which could be the same as this user we've got passed or an organization that they're part of. Here's another query that searches for PRs that the user just commented on. Those examples are using this method search issues, which is from the Authenticate library here. So I'm using that just as a client for the GitHub API. There are a whole bunch of other libraries listed at that URL. I'm also using Ruby in these examples, but there are wrappers in many other languages. So whichever library you use, or if you want to make raw requests yourself, the developer docs have all the reference material you'd need on what parameters are available to the endpoints to help you build up a query that suits your needs. So we've made our call to search issues, and we'd get a response back from the API. The developer documentation will show you examples of the kind of response you'd get back from any endpoint. This includes here an array of the relevant issues from our search query. This is a simplified version of that and shows that you could extract whatever the key bits of information you'd like from that response. And then we just need to prepare some strings with those key pieces of information. And for this example, we could send that prepared string of the content back to the Slack app, and that gets presented to the user. For fetching pull requests labeled with a certain label, the app could have a method labeled which accepts parameters for which labels to search for. Again, we just pass those parameters into the app and build up a query of what we want to search for. It's really useful to check your expected results with the advanced search page in the web UI. The API request will use the exact same query syntax as on the web. And then we just make an API request to search issues using that query that we built up. And the Slack app could display those results to the user. Similarly, we could search for PRs awaiting a given team's response. Just building up a query, slightly different parameters. So for open PRs within the given organization that mention this team, that members of that team haven't commented on yet. So this would be the flow of events. Basically, the user would send a command from that Slack app. The Slack app passes the request with, in this case, the team name parameter to the GitHub app. The GitHub app needs to just build up the relevant query and ask the API for pull requests that match that query. The GitHub app then prepares and sends that data for the Slack app to display, and the Slack app displays it. So if you wanted to create an issue for your team's activity, which many of the teams at GitHub do, just as a weekly sort of what's happening focus for the team, the app could have a radar method, is our name for that, which accepts post parameters for the GitHub team and the repository. Our app could prepare some default text for that, gather any other bits of information that the team might be interested in, and deliver that output. For example, creating an issue on github.com via the API. Some other possibilities, maybe your company has a manual set of steps for onboarding a new team member. Perhaps some of that could be automated via the API, like adding someone as a collaborator to certain repositories, adding them to certain teams. Your team or company might have a really particular process to approve a pull request that the web UI just doesn't cater for. Like maybe you need more than 2 people to have reviewed it, or the reviewers can't also have written the code. And you could use the API to carry out those checks. Or if your team or company has an example that's more like this, maybe just consider that a lot of great companies are hiring right now. But let's take a look at this example. So maybe your team needs to ensure that the PR is reviewed by someone who didn't also write the code. You could fetch a list of commits on a PR. The developer site here will give you an example response of what that would look like. A simplified example of that response would be JSON like this. So you see you could extract the authors from that list of people who committed on the PR. You could then fetch a list of reviews on a PR and extract the names of the users who have given those reviews, and then do whatever special comparison your team wants to do about those committers and reviewers and who they are. And then you could post a status on the PR to indicate if it passed or failed your checks. That status you send via the API will be represented as a passing check in the web UI. And if you've set that review process status as being required, the PR would then show that it's allowed to be merged. So to summarize, I'd suggest just thinking about what the pain points that are in your team's workflow. And are there any flows that you currently carry out in maybe a laborious manual process that maybe some of those could be candidates for automating via some scripts or a GitHub app? Maybe you work back from whatever the problem is then that causes that pain, like whether it's that you want to know what bugs have been reported or what pull requests your team needs to review, or just having sort of easy awareness of what's going on with your team. And then think about what you want to end up with Maybe it's something to glance quickly at from chat. Maybe it's an email or an issue on GitHub. And then if that problem area is to do with commits or pull requests or organization members, you will hopefully find an API in the docs with examples of fetching the information that you'd need. And from those docs and those individual APIs, you could hopefully see examples of just exactly what information you'd be able to get. And again, please do talk to us and other developers who are building things with the API. If you have a question, you're unlikely to be alone. The API is a powerful, very flexible tool. I hope this talk and other ones at this conference help it become less intimidating and becomes a tool that you just enjoy exploring and building on to do whatever special, crazy, awesome thing it is that you and your team do. Thank you. We'll be around at the Ask GitHub desk today, tomorrow. The platform team, if you have any questions, feel free to come talk to us there.